Hi guys, this is a tutorial on how to collect data and display it in the data table and then turn the data into a bar graph. So the example that you see on the screen, 8th grade students' favorite sports, is the example that I'll use throughout this tutorial. So during a science experiment, really the main goal is to collect data in order to prove your hypothesis as being true or untrue, or supported or unsupported. So when you collect data, it's helpful to put your data into a data table. It just keeps things organized and easy to see. Once you have your data table complete, then you can turn that data easily into a graph, which is really a nice way to just display your data for people to look at, for yourself to look at. So in each data table, there are a couple of things you want to make sure to include. The first is the title. The title should be specific enough that someone looking at the data table knows exactly what the data is that you collected from your experiment. So for this example, the data here is about 8th grade students' favorite sports. Notice on the left side of this two-column table is the independent variable. And remember, that's the one that you as the scientist can change. So I came up with 4 different types of sports. Depending on which sport I allow people to choose, the number of the students will choose a different one. So the number of students is going to depend on the type of sport. So in the left column of your data table, always list your independent variable. In the right column will be your dependent variable. And this is where you're going to put actual quantitative data, numbers, number of students. After you've collected your data and you put it in a nice organized data table, you can turn that into a graph. Graphs are really useful in science because they help you to visualize your data. So it's easy to look at a graph and say, okay, well, I can see who has the most birthdays by month, or which day of the week I sold the most muffins, or what the favorite activity is of people. So you can easily look at the data, and the type of graph that you make really is going to depend on the type of data that you've collected. So for our example for favorite sports, we're going to turn that into a bar graph, which you'll see in a moment. This is an example of a bar graph down here. Eventually, your catapult project data will be plotted on a bar graph as well. All right, guys, there are a couple of things you need to make sure to include on your bar graph. One of them is the title. The title needs to be very specific so that people looking at your graph know exactly what your data is about. So we have specifically data on 8th grade students' favorite sports. If you just wrote sports or even favorite sports, that wouldn't really be specific enough. I want to know who I polled or who I surveyed to get that data from. So 8th grade students' favorite sports is a great specific title. There are 2 axes on every graph. First one I'll talk about is the y-axis, which is the tall axis, kind of goes up and down. I remember the y-axis is the tall axis because y is kind of like a tall number. And this is where you're going to plot your dependent variable. So the number of students is going to depend on the different types of sports. So the y-axis has 2 things. The first is the label. Number of students would be the label. Then you can see a scale from 0 to 10. This is where you're going to indicate what your actual data is. So number of students, number of people, the range should include the highest and the lowest points of your data, basically. The other axis on a bar graph is the x-axis. This is the horizontal one, and this is where we plot our independent variable. Notice there are 2 things on this x-axis. One is the label, which would be sport, and then the 4 categories of sports. So soccer, softball, basketball, and other, those were the 4 categories, and I have to indicate those on the bar graph as well. Okay, guys, when you go to make a bar graph, there are a couple of steps you need to follow to make sure you have all the requirements on the graph. And I'm going to go through the 5 steps. On the blue paper that you have in front of you, the notes sheet, I'd like for you to copy down the words that are highlighted in yellow into the blank. So it's pretty much like a fill in the blank. So the first step says, on a graph paper, draw a horizontal or x-axis and a vertical or y-axis. So the size of your graph is going to depend on how much data you have, but you can kind of estimate, and I'm going to start my graph here. Obviously, when you do yours, you can use a ruler to make your lines nice and straight, but I'll do my best here. Okay. All right. Remember, x-axis is the horizontal, which goes left to right, and the y-axis is the taller one that goes up and down. Second step is to write the name of the categories to be graphed along the horizontal axis and include an overall label for the axis. So the categories here, guys, are the sports, and my overall label is going to be sports. My categories are going to be soccer, softball, basketball, and others. So I'm just going to make this nice and neat over here and just do my best to kind of evenly space them. Even make my line a little bit long. All right. Here's my label. Here are my categories. Step number 3 says to label the vertical axis with the name of the responding or the dependent variable. That is number of students. So I'm just going to write number of students. Include units of measurement, then create a scale along the axis by marking off equally spaced numbers that include the range of data. So numbers of students doesn't really need any unit, but I do need to figure out my scale. And remember, it needs to include the smallest point of data and the highest point of data. So I need to create a scale to include all the way from 3 to 9. And I'm just going to make mine nice and even. Start at 0, maybe skip a line and have every other line be a unit of 1. All the way up to 10. The next step, for each category, draw a solid bar using the scale on the vertical axis to determine the height. Make all the bars the same width. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to look at soccer. All right, 9 students voted soccer as being their favorite. And remember, we want to make them all the same width. So I'm going to make mine actually 2 rows wide. I'm going to do my best to make this straight. Now, notice how I have my bar coming up to here. If I look across at number 9 there, this is indicating that 9 people chose soccer as their favorite sport, okay? You wouldn't want to put that top of that bar any higher or any lower than the 9, because if you did, that would not be a good representation of your data. Okay? I'm just going to color my bar. The next is softball. So I'm going to look over here. Oops, all right. 4 people voted at softball. Now notice that 4 is on the line. So I'm going to draw my bar for softball up to the number 4. Six people voted basketball as being their favorite sport. So I'm going to be careful to draw the bar up to the number 6 line. And then 3 people voted as other sports being their favorite. The last step, step number 5, is to create a title that describes our graph. And really, you can use the same title as in your data table, which is 8th grade students' favorite sports. So this one is not super neat, guys, but obviously when you use your ruler to create your bar graph, it's going to be nice and neat, and all your bars will be straight and even, so you can get a nice representation of your data. The next step after you create the graph is to actually analyze the graph. So this is why we make graphs, because it makes it nice and easy to look at the graph and determine, well, what's the actual favorite sport. So just by looking at this, you can see that soccer has the highest bar, meaning 9 people voted as having soccer as their favorite sport. You can easily see that the least amount of people, only 3, voted for other as their favorite sport. If there was a question, how many people voted for softball, you could easily follow this bar up to the number 4, and know that 4 people voted for soccer as their favorite sport. Softball as their favorite sport. Basketball, same thing. How many people chose basketball as their favorite sport? That bar goes up to 6, so I know 6 people. You should see this graph on the blue paper that you have. Notice that this has all the requirements for the bar graph. When you're making a bar graph, make sure you include all these things. And at this point, you should go back to the lesson in Schoology and take the ungraded graphing review quiz. There are 6 questions that will just have you practice identifying variables and describe different parts of things that you should have on your bar graph. Don't forget about the back of the blue paper also. There's a bar graph called Garden Creatures. You should have this finished for tomorrow's class. There's a couple of questions at the bottom, and you'll be actually plotting some data on the graph as well. So make sure you go back to the Schoology lesson, do the graphing review quiz, and finish